to me. So how about head coverings? That would be nice for bald guys, but he's really talking about head coverings for women there. And through much of history, many people thought that we should take this and apply this to all cultures, that women in all cultures in church need to wear head coverings. Most North American Christians say no, but most Christians through history said yes. Are they right? Are North American Christians right? Well, it depends. I surveyed many of my students when I was lecturing on this in northern Nigeria. One said women who didn't wear head coverings to church would go to hell. That was a rather extreme position. Nobody else agreed with him, happily. Nearly half of the students there thought they were mandatory for all cultures. Most of the others said, no, they're only mandatory in cultures where it's the custom, which it is in northern Nigeria. So they thought it was mandatory in their culture, but not for all cultures. We have a lot of pictures of people wearing head coverings. Here's one from the Athenian Museum, National Museum of Greece in Athens from the 4th century BC with women wearing head coverings. The purpose of head coverings in Paul's day, well, depended on who you were, what you were doing with them. People covered their heads for shame, for grief, for fear. That was men and women. Romans covered their heads for worship. Greeks uncovered their heads for worship. But again, that wasn't gender-based. The one gender-linked head covering custom, and this predominated especially in the East, although there's a good book called Aphrodite's Tortoise that documents head coverings in a lot of the Mediterranean world. Women's hair was the prime object of male lust. Apuleius, who was a writer of different things, he writes a book called The Metamorphosis. And early in the book, there's this guy, he's going around, he's very promiscuous, and he's staring at women's uncovered hair so he can memorize their hairstyles and go home and lust after them in his heart. Well, women's hair was the prime object of male lust, primarily because it was one of the few things that was uncovered most of the time for those who were single. Married women in the Eastern Mediterranean covered their hair to prevent others from seeing their hair. You know, unmarried, there's a Spartan saying, married women cover their heads to keep their husbands. Unmarried women, girls, because normally they married pretty early, as we mentioned. There was a shortage of them, so their parents tended to marry them off back then. So that's the culture. But keep in mind that when I recount the culture, I'm not endorsing these things. But anyway, the unmarried girls would keep their heads uncovered to get husbands. Now, further to the east, the entire face might be covered. Some people think, oh, that's an Islamic custom. It may be a frequent Islamic custom, but it was a Middle Eastern custom before Islam. To not wear the head covering was considered a deliberate attempt at seduction, attempted adultery. The distraction might be roughly equivalent to walking into church in a bathing suit today. Now, I don't know, if you know, in the height of the Jesus movement, California, the beach churches, you know, probably a lot of people did come in bathing suits. But at least where I'm living, if you walk into church in a bathing suit, and especially a skimpy bathing suit, it doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman, you walk into church in a bathing suit, you're going to distract some people. Now, please do not let my superiors in my seminary where I teach, do not inform them, please, that I showed a picture of semi-naked dancing frogs. But there was another problem. Upper-class women didn't like to have to cover their heads, especially when they're home. And guess what? Where did the churches meet? They normally met in the homes of, you know, the more spacious homes. So here's the hostess, the matron of the home. Why does she have to cover her head? She's not out in public. She's at home. Well, whenever the empress changed her hairstyle, it started a new wave of fashion throughout the empire. You think I'm joking, but I'm really serious. I mean, fashions didn't spread as quickly back then as they do now, but you know, they didn't have mass media, really quick communication. But they paid a lot of money for their hairstyles, so they didn't want to have to cover them up. But what the wealthier women meant is ostentation, which is not so good in itself. Poor women understood as seduction, which was much worse. So imagine you're coming into the church service. Some people say, in Corinth, the women must have been in the synagogue balcony. Two problems there. One is we don't have attestation for women being segregated in the balcony in synagogues in the first century. It may be possible. Certainly it was practiced in medieval synagogues. But the other is, we also know from Acts 18, the believers weren't meeting in the synagogue anymore. They were meeting in homes. So forget the balcony. Unless, you have an atrium in a Roman home, maybe you've got this hole over the impluvium. Hey, maybe they're leaning over the hole on the roof, but that's not very likely. So what the wealthier women meant is ostentation. The poor women understood as seduction. So coming to church and their husbands are getting distracted. Okay, from what Jesus told us, it's the husband's own problem if he's getting distracted. But, the wives had a point. Don't distract my husband by making everybody look at you. The church met in the larger homes, so poor and richer Christians met together. And this created a sort of class tension in the church, which is also a bad thing. Paul's been talking about giving up rights, including his own, and so he urges the wealthier women to do that here. And but it's still their choice. I mean, he says the woman has authority over her own head. A lot of translations add something to that. Let her wear a symbol of authority over her head. It doesn't say that in Greek. It just says let her have authority over her head, but in other words, let her exercise it in a responsible way. Because of the angels and some other stuff he says that I don't have time to go into in a survey, but maybe someday I've probably written on it somewhere. I know I wrote it in the commentary. Oh, and I wrote it in another book, so it's out there. But anyway, when my students in Nigeria were debating each other about the need for head coverings, one protested, but the Bible commands us to wear head coverings. That's true. As I pointed out afterwards, the Bible commands a holy kiss 5 times as often as head coverings, but none of you greeted me with a holy kiss when I came into the room. They laughed. Too late now, I added. Head coverings were part of their culture, but familial and holy kisses were not. And back then, it was normally a light kiss on the lips, but very easily, usually that. It could be, persons of higher rank, you might kiss them on the hand or something, but usually a light kiss on the lips, but very distinct from a passionate kiss. Although later on, the church did make up rules that the holy kiss was to be restricted to one's own gender. And there were some people who did, have to be corrected. So head coverings were part of the culture in northern Nigeria, but kisses as greetings were not. But then there are cultures where you greet people, close people, with a kiss. In the first century, I don't think they had toothpaste. They definitely did not have Listerine. I don't know how they did it. Anyway, most of the class I was with in Nigeria agreed with me that Paul's principles were more important than his application. So avoiding seduction, ostentation, and class conflict were more important than the specific rule against head coverings. But are there any situations where these principles might militate against wearing head coverings? Like, could really cool head coverings be used to attract cross-gender attention? Could they ever be used for ostentation to show off? Like, I got a really wealthy, expensive head covering. Could they highlight the disparity of rich and poor head covering buyers? Well, my students agreed that at times these things happen. So I'm not saying you can't wear head coverings or you can't wear a hat to church if you want to, but I'm just saying that if you're going to wear head covering, buy the same brand. No, just saying that we learn from Paul's principles, which he was applying to the concrete situation in that culture. when we read his letters, we need to recontextualize those principles in ways relevant for our culture. There are other ways to be ostentatious or seductive, and this applies to men and women. It's not just women, and that was the issue in that church. But there are other ways to be ostentatious or seductive, and by not wearing a hat to church. I don't wear a hat to church, by the way, even though I'm bald. Well,